Ring around the rosy.
So this story happened just this summer. I've spent a lot of my life wandering in and enjoying the backcountry. I'm older now and have settled down in the suburbs. Wife, 2 boys, a house, a dog, and a desk job. I want opportunities for my kids that come from suburban life, but I also want them to grow up with an appreciation for the outdoors. So when my oldest son was big enough for his first solo father-son camping trip, I was excited. My wife and younger son stayed home for this midsummer trip. It was going to be a great bonding experience for me and my son. Because my son is just 5, I didn't want to do anything too extreme on our first big solo camping trip. We needed a place that wasn't too deep into the Colorado Front Range, but still allowed for dispersed camping. I don't consider camping in RV parks or established campgrounds to be actual camping. Camping at most is a tent, sleeping bag, and a fire. A dispersed camping area called Gordon Gulch caught my attention. I had never been to this area before. There were no facilities and it was dispersed enough you couldn't see or hear other campers nearby. My son and I had a blast that day. We set up camp, collected firewood, went for a hike, saw a moose and a bobcat, tried a little fishing, and finally, as the sunlight faded, we returned to our campsite to light a fire. We had a traditional and nutritious camping meal of fire-burned hot dogs and marshmallows. It was a good day, definitely a core memory for both my son and me, the perfect first camping experience for a preschooler, or so I thought. After all that fun, my son and I were exhausted. It was time for bed. The sound of an evening summer breeze through the pines is better than any commercial sleep aid. I don't even remember drifting off. It was a hard, dreamless sleep that only physical exertion can bring. One thing about my son is that he inherited many things from me: hair color, eye shape, disposition, and my unusually white feet, but one peculiar thing he got from his mother was sleep talking. It's not unusual to hear him having full conversations in his sleep. It gets more pronounced when he's overly tired. I was sleeping peacefully. The world seemed to be at peace. It was quiet, just me and the breeze through the treetops. Suddenly, I got woken up by the sound of my son laughing in his sleep. It was a deep belly laugh. Gently rocking him was enough to quiet him down. As I repositioned to fall back to sleep, my son burst out laughing. I sighed and closed my eyes. He'll quiet down soon enough, I thought, but he laughed again. This time his laugh was echoed by something outside our tent. I held my breath and listened, unsure of what I just heard. It wasn't an echo. There was something out there and it was laughing in unison with my son. It couldn't be real. It had to be my imagination. I confronted myself. I sat up in my sleeping bag listening to the night, hearing nothing. After a minute, my muscles relaxed. I started to settle back down. I was tired after all. Checking the time, I saw it was 4 a.m. The sun would be up in a couple of hours. My son laughed again, and again it was answered with laughter outside. I was now certain it was not an echo. As I tried to make sense of what was happening, the voice outside called out my son's name. My blood ran cold. That voice, it was so familiar. Then it clicked in my brain. It was the voice of my younger son. That wasn't at all possible. He was safe at home with my wife, miles and miles away. It was impossible to tell the distance from us, but there was something out there. This time, it called out my son's name in that little toddler voice. The floodgates of my adrenaline burst open. I was putting a stop to this. Whatever it was out there, I didn't care. Say what you will, but when you're camping miles from anything, it's not worth the risk of being unarmed. Wild animals, wild people, you have to be prepared. I almost always take a firearm with me when I'm camping. Pepper spray and bear bells are great, but nothing gets attention from a conscious threat faster than the sound of chambering around. I spoke loudly into the night that I had a gun and was coming out. I hoped the fear in my voice was masked by my aggressiveness. My son was still asleep. Kid's a hard sleeper, another trait from his mom. Stepping out into the cool summer night, a gun in one hand and a flashlight in the other, I surveyed the campsite. The fire was down to embers. Our fishing gear was leaning against the pickup. The firewood was still neatly stacked. Nothing seemed out of place. Not wanting to stay far from the tent or my sleeping son, I sat down outside the entrance. I waited in the dark with the flashlight off. Not far into the trees, I heard a branch break. Then another snapped, this time closer. I stood up and flashed my light in the direction of the sound. Nothing was there. The voice called out, this time from behind, and this time focused towards me. "Daddy?" It was my youngest son's voice again, crying out for me from the dark forest. I threw the light beam in that direction and I saw a pair of red eyes. I was so scared that I was literally shaking my legs. It was the same height as a toddler. I fired the gun in the sky to scare the thing, but still, it didn't move an inch. Suddenly, my son in the tent behind me began to scream. I rushed inside the tent to check out. He was finally awake. I made sure he was okay, and then I peeked outside the tent to look for that thing, but it was gone. That creepy red eye had disappeared. I didn't stay in that sight for a minute after that. I put my son in the car, locked the doors, and wasted little time breaking down camp. We were out of that camp and back on the road by the time the sun broke over the horizon. I have no idea what is in those woods. I do plan to camp in that area again, without my family, and definitely with some friends. I want to find out more about that thing. Thankfully, my son doesn't seem fazed by anything that happened that night. He thinks I was chasing a bear away from camp. My son can't wait to go on another camping trip, but, truthfully, I'm thinking the next family camping trip might be at an RV park, or even a motel. So I am going to share my only paranormal experience of my life. This happened about a week ago. I woke up around 1 a.m. to prepare for my usual night shift. I noticed that my cat, Brunch, who typically sleeps at the foot of my bed, had left in the middle of the night. This wasn't unusual, but the door to my room was closed, with no other way out. I got confused and quickly searched the room, but after being unable to find him, I figured my older sister had taken the poor cat away to her room. I finished preparing and was ready to head out. But just as I reached for the doorknob, I heard a soft hiss coming from my room. I went back in, convinced that Brunch was just hiding somewhere out of sight. Peering under the bed, I discovered Brunch. He was huddled at the far end of the bed behind an assortment of shoeboxes. I had never seen him behave like this before. After calling out to him for a few minutes, I was worried that something was wrong with Brunch. I awkwardly attempted to crawl under the bed and pull him out. While I was not particularly fond of cats, Brunch had always been a quiet and gentle companion to me since my childhood. He had never scratched me, or anyone else for that matter, yet for the first time, as I reached out to him, he slashed my arm, leaving a deep wound. I retreated from under the bed, bleeding a lot more than I would have expected. With a mix of frustration from the sudden violence and panic at the sight of blood all over my arm and clothes, I realized that I probably wasn't going to make it to work on time. I hurriedly messaged my boss letting them know I would be late. Brunch was still hiding under the bed, and just as I was about to try coaxing him out again, I heard a knock on the front door. Who knocks on people's doors at 2 a.m? I questioned myself. I stepped into the hallway, moving cautiously towards the door. Through the frosted window, I could see a somewhat familiar figure standing there. My heart pounded as I slowly approached. That's when I heard a voice saying, "Hey, let me in." The voice in the dead of night sent shivers down my spine, but the most chilling part was the familiarity of the voice itself. Guess what? I noticed it was my voice. The figure on the other side of the door was unmistakably me. It kept repeating, "Hey, let me in," repeatedly, constantly knocking on the door. Fear set in as I realized that any of my family members would have opened the door. I was supposed to have left for work by now. I began to back away from the door. That thing inched closer, attempting to peer through the frosted window. When he did, our eyes locked, and for a brief moment, it seemed surprised. But then it smiled. The most sinister, unnerving smile. A smile that I would never make. At that moment, it silently backed away from the window and vanished into the night. Needless to say, I never made it to work that night, or any night since. It's been a week since that incident, and my family thinks I'm crazy for locking myself away in my room, telling me it was just some sort of prank. I still wonder what that thing was, and why was it exactly like me? My name is John, and I have been in force for past 10 years. I've seen a lot of things in my career, things that would make a citizen doubt my sanity. But the most unusual thing that happened to me was witnessed by several officers and a dispatcher. I still remember the date. It was June 7th, 2013. I had brought in a guy for domestic violence and he was a bit rowdy. For this story, let's call him Mr. Tough Guy. I was joined in a booking by the sergeant and another patrolman. I was in the process of booking Mr. Tough Guy and I glanced into cell number 1. There was a guy in there with a short haircut, glasses, and a white t-shirt just staring at me. I ignored him because I didn't want him to start banging on the window demanding a phone call or something. So I finished the booking process and escorted Mr. Tough Guy to his cell. Walking past cell number 1, the guy in the cell just stood there never saying a word or moving. Looking at him gave me a creepy feeling, but I ignored him. We all then left the booking. Sometime later, the sergeant asked me to check the paperwork for the prisoners to see if anyone was ready to be transported to the county jail. I graded the paperwork and went into booking to do a head count, but the cell number 1 was empty. I panicked and told the sergeant about it. He also started to panic and he and I began to make phone calls to the detectives to see if they had moved the guy or had released him. They all said that they never went into booking at all. I then rechecked the computer and paperwork and the head count was accurate. To my surprise, no one had been placed in cell number 1. I got scared. If no one was ever placed in cell 1, then who did I saw earlier? As per the papers, no one was placed on that cell. We went to the dispatch office to check the surveillance video of the booking. We rewinded the footage to where I could be seen booking my prisoner. We fast forward to the point in the video where we all walked out. As soon as we walked past cell 1, there was no one there. The cell was empty, but I could see myself staring at that cell. We were all freaked out by seeing that. We were sure that we saw a guy in that cell. We still hear and see stuff every now. Prisoners in the detox tank can be seen talking to someone in the direction of cell number 1 even though it appears empty. To this day I'm scared of going into booking alone. I did some research about the cell and guess what? The guy I saw earlier had killed himself in that cell 50 years ago. This is the only paranormal incident I have ever had in my life and I still get goosebumps every time I remember this incident.